Farming food and fashion for a discerning world is serious business in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are new opportunities everywhere just waiting for the open-minded. Sarah's Country shines a light on the matters that matter most. And here's your host, Sarah Perriam.
Kia ora and welcome to Sarah's Country. This is a place that I often state is for open hearts and open minds to the challenges facing rural New Zealand. So therefore, it's important that I too have an open mind, especially to the challenges facing land use in rural New Zealand. And when I hear about the New Zealand pastoral farmers' cries about the impact of forestry operations, I had to keep in check that I personally didn't know much about forestry. And so when the invitation popped up for Forest Owners Association Phil Taylor to head down to Geraldine and take Joel, my cameraman, into the forest, we jumped at the chance. But I said that I want a warts and all look at what is a pine plantation. I want to be able to ask those hard questions. So I have to state, it was not a paid gig. I just really like the opportunity to take Sarah's Country on the road and actually have an open mind to something I personally didn't know a lot about. Particularly for Phil, after taking on the chair of the Forest Owners Association role recently from a polarising figure that was Peter Weir, Phil is on a mission to rebuild the industry's social licence within the wider rural community, as his day job is the managing director of Port Blakely, a sixth-generation US-based family business employing 350 people that started logging here in 1989. They bought forests from what were the ex-New Zealand Forest Service forests. This was the New Zealand government selling off under the state-owned enterprise sell-off of the forest assets. And so the importance for Phil to say, righto, we have some work to do. Let's fling open the doors. I had to, of course, jump at the chance. Phil said I could ask whatever I like. However, there wasn't really, in the scheme of things, a lot to fit in within 4 hours. However, we did our absolute best to answer some of the questions around the debate circling around planting the right tree in the right place. And questions like, are they biological deserts dead of life? Are they really safe places for people to work with so many deaths? And what about the communities they destroy? So for you in the Opinion Maker this week, a bit of a treat taking Sarah's Country on the road. Visually, if you're watching along, you are definitely in for a treat. I started off with Phil in the car on my way to the forest. Well, thank you so much, Phil, for having me with you today. It's an interesting and unique concept to actually take the show out on the road, but when you posed the question about coming out and actually seeing for myself, I actually thought it's important to preach do what I'm preaching, which is having an open mind. And every industry in the primary sector has a social licence. There's a lot we're going to discuss today. But why is it important to get the likes of me and our audience out on the road and actually seeing a working forest?
Really, there's a lot of misunderstanding about all rural land uses, not just forestry or farming, but all rural land uses. And I think it's really important that we understand sort of the underlying issues that impact on each of those land uses. And from a forestry perspective, there are some challenges we have. And increasingly, the issue of social license to operate is something that the industry is focusing a lot of attention on. And like all rural land users, we have our Achilles heels. And the important thing is that we stand up and be held accountable for those sorts of things. A classic example is Tolaga Bay. That was an unfortunate event. It was caused by extreme situation, but nonetheless, our activities impacted on people, and we need to be accountable for that, and we need to make sure that we improve our performance, because unless we do that, communities won't see our commitment to improving the way we manage our forests and reducing the external impacts that our operations have on communities and people as a whole. What you're going to see today is not going to be all about monoculture radiata. And I think this is one of the things that I really want to get across in terms of my message today, is that forestry is not just simply a monoculture of pine that's planted and harvested and replanted. There's lots of environmental and social benefits as well as the economic benefits that come out of forestry. It's going to be a warts and all tour today. I'm quite happy to answer any of the challenging questions you push our way. So we're quite happy to stand up, and the main purpose of the trip today really is to provide an insight into how a production forestry works, and also to let people know that this is not unique to Port Blakely. The forestry sector is by and large doing this kind of work.
Well, Port Blakely was purchased in the 80s from the New Zealand Forest Service as the New Zealand government sold off its forests under the state-owned enterprise divestment. The company owns 32,000 hectares, with much of the forest onto its second to fourth rotation to harvest. Meeting us on site was Port Blakely's Environment Manager, Zach Robinson, to set the scene on the challenge of native trees versus pine plantations and how the two can coexist. Now, where we're situated right now for a bit of atmospheric noise is on just beside a harvest site, and there's a lot of felled land behind me, but also you can see the pockets of native bush. Zach, my first question is, that must be a nightmare to harvest in between all the native forests.
Yep, no, it makes things complicated, but our guys are very much committed to that. It's all about having the right gear, the right systems in place, and a lot of robust planning at the front end, basically. So
with the Indigenous biodiversity rules, the significant natural areas that the government's talking about flying over and finding, it'll be the same for forestry?
Yeah, very much so. So everything you can see here, those native pockets are all classified SNA, or significant natural areas, by the Timaru District Council here. They've been very proactive with their SNA survey, so they were completed sort of around 2012, and for our region here in the Timaru District, we have around 530 hectares of significant natural areas that we're managing.
That would be quite considerable for the region that you're in charge of.
I believe we're probably the biggest private landowner of SNAs in the region. So.
Now, there has been, anything to do with the national policy statement is huge amounts of grey area, should we say, around the interpretation of them, and some of them, I tell you what, are absolutely ludicrous in parts of the pastoral sector. But in forestry, is it similar? Is the rules not that practical in general?
Look, I think the current rules are okay. Like we protect all these SNA areas or any indigenous bush within our forests. All the harvesting has to be taken away, nothing's falled into it, those sorts of things. The proposed rules, so the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity, they've got some pretty significant changes which would have some very big implications for the forest industry. My personal view is that drawing lines on maps around Indigenous biodiversity is not going to improve the environment or our ecosystems. I think the biggest thing we can do is start looking at more pest control and those sorts of things. Everyone wants to look after the native. Drawing a map and putting red tape around it is not really going to help that so much.
When you've got a felled forest like that, do all the birds just disappear?
No, not at all. Like the falcon, for example, absolutely love cutover.
They can see all the rabbits.
Yeah, that's right. It's great for hunting, and we're currently involved with a falcon study down on coastal Otago with a number of other forestry companies, and just learn more about how the sort of broken landscapes of plantation forestry down there is really benefiting the falcon population.
Oh, right, so having pockets of cleared and established forests.
Yeah, it's the mosaic, and I think that's why when you look at this forest here, Geraldine, for example, we've got a huge amount of pockets of SNAs, and I was speaking to the ecologist who did the surveys a couple of weeks ago, and over the back we have some large pockets of up to 80 hectares, and then we have very small ones here, and the benefit of that from talking to him is around the connectivity. So we're creating sort of these pockets of where wildlife and ecosystems can slowly spread. So I think connectivity is a big thing. It's not just about big large areas of native, you've got to have those little patches in between as well.
But let's be honest, from what I can see there, that's steep,
yep.
And just it must be expensive to harvest around native. Why don't you just sort of put just that section in natives?
Well, that's what we're starting to look at now. So obviously when these were planted 30 years ago, SNA wasn't even a thing. So
lots of things weren't a thing.
That's right. So things are all changing. We're moving with the times as well. We're recently harvesting around some quite tricky SNA areas, and what we're finding is that it's actually probably going to be beneficial to sort of close those gaps up and put them back into native instead of pine, just for the fact of making things easier for harvesting in the next rotation, but also it benefits the environment side of things. The only part of that is we've got to make sure we do our due diligence around ETS and deforestation liabilities. We've cut down the pine trees that were in there. If we don't replant, it's classified as deforestation. So a lot more expensive to plant natives, take a lot more care, but worth it in the long run.
Well, we're going to catch up with Zach later in the show in the Raincliffe Forest to learn more about the endangered bat they're protecting. But also, I wanted to know, is there truth to those that describe production forests as biological deserts? Well, planting steeper hillsides into natives could have an environmental benefit, but the technology and skill of the current foresters on the steep harvesting site at Port Blakely's was impressive. Glenn Paul from Cable Logging Geraldine was there to give me the lowdown on how they safely fell and grade those logs from those steep hillsides.
I found a man who knows a thing or two about grading logs and harvesting them, Glenn Paul, working here at Port Blakely. You know, a log's not a log.
Not quite.
This is, as was just described to me, the eye fillet of logs as opposed to the mince, which is the debris.
Yep.
Are you effectively sorting them into piles as you're going as well?
Yeah, so what happens here is they come up from down the hill, I grab them and deliver them, take all the branches off, and then it's my role to grade all the logs. So here we have about 6 or 7 different grades I can cut for. The heap we stand behind here is the prime wood, so it's all, this stuff goes to the west coast, it's all the prune. And then I cut for a mill in Christchurch, which is domestic saw logs. A lot of that is used for building. And then Shands Road, which is in Christchurch as well, which is used for pallets. And then everything below that goes as export to China or Korea, just depending on the length.
Do you reckon we can have a wee look inside the cab?
Yeah,
because
go for it.
I hear it's quite like, you know, our tractors down on the flat. You would be surprised when you get in them about how much technology there is.
Yeah, there's a fair bit of technology in it, but I just sit down and push buttons and the machine does the work.
Awesome, let's go and have a look.
Let's go do it.
Okay, so right now it actually feels like we're in a helicopter cab. You've got your collectives on both sides and your seatbelt strapped in. So you've got, obviously a tree grows from a base and then you've got the skinnier parts at the end. You're chopping those off.
No, I can use the whole tree.
Oh yeah?
So we can export down to 100 mil, so 4 inches.
They don't mind if they go from fat to skinny?
No, they do not mind, so I can cover a whole size of the tree. So this is the eye fillet, because it's all clears. So this head's looking for a 6'1" at 35. It's got a 6'1" at 44. So for the head, it only measures the length and the size, so it gets a big tick. Then I just got to visually grade it. So I'm happy with it. Automatically spits out the next one. And I'm just looking for knot sizes, any sweep.
Hey Glenn, can I just talk to you about, like, I mean, we're inside a cab, there's no people on the ground. I mean, the forestry industry has had its fair share of bad luck, so to speak, with fatalities on sites.
Yes, it has.
What I can see right here, right now, is there's no humans out around any of these machines, eh?
No, so we are a fully mechanised crew. So there is no one currently on the ground. It's a massive improvement for health and safety wise. I've been in the industry for coming up 16 years and I've seen a massive improvement on the health and safety side of things. Obviously mechanised processing has changed that quite a lot. Don't get me wrong, there are times where we need to put men on the ground and we do assess all those risks and dangers, but the main objective at Port Blakely and also Cable Logging Geraldine is that everyone goes home at the end of the night.
We employ a lot of people in our forest operations. Port Blakely has around about 350 people working under contract in its forests. It also employs 25 New Zealanders, New Zealand citizens. So there is this perception, I think, out there that the foreign-owned companies just employ foreign people, extract value and then export it back overseas in terms of the money. That's far from the truth. So how do we engage with the community? Well, most of the workers that we employ live in the rural community, in Geraldine, in Waimati, in Oamaru, Palmerston. It's a privilege for us to own land in New Zealand and to work with these communities. It's not a right. And so we respect the need to basically contribute and give back to those communities. It's a lot easier to work with your communities and understand their concerns than to ignore them. And so certainly part of our investment in communities is all about engaging with them, making sure that they understand what we're doing, what our values are, and how we're trying to improve the business and what the impacts of the community will be. You know, it's important that communities understand what's happening out in those forests in the rural community.
Well, the Opinion Makers shows are proudly brought to you by our friends at Farmlands. Now, give us your opinion on what you've heard or seen so far. If you're watching along on Facebook or YouTube, you can comment along with those watching at the same time, or send me an email, sarah@sarahscountry.com. I want to hear your opinion on what you've seen or heard.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop for the things you need to live out here.
like electric fencing,
or horse feed,
or bee suits,
children, chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
Or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this.
But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help you farm,
grow, milk, drench,
rear, come on in.
Because we're out here too.
I understand that forest operations are actually starting to feel that pressure from local councils now around forestry's role on the degradation of rural roads. So understanding their concerns rather than ignoring them is a good start. But that's not a community's only concern, especially when 40,000 cubic metres of slash ends up on your beach. We're going to hear now from Port Blakely's wood fibre recovery manager, Andrew Cocking, who's taking the slash known as wood residue off the sides of the hills. And so therefore in those adverse weather events, we will not see logs slip off the hills as we did in Tolaga Bay.
Oh, g'day Andrew, how are you?
Good, Sarah, yourself?
Yeah, good.
Welcome to a forest.
Thank you very much. Well, at the moment though, it's more a bit of a woodlot of dried debris, is it?
Yeah, well this is actually a product from a forest harvesting operation. That's what we call our residue recovery. Not merchantable for saw logs or for domestic mills or export, but we're pulling it away from a logging operation and storing it in the forest on our infrastructure, and curing it for 12 months or drying out, lowering the moisture content, and then making it available as a fuel source for some of the energy businesses in Timaru. Yeah.
So we can see here a whole heap of chipped products. You've brought it from the logging site up to here to dry out, and then what's the process from that afterwards? From where do you stop and start, and how does the process work through to those boilers? Yeah,
well, for us, obviously we're accumulating the product. We completely own it. We ring fence it, and then I have a number of customers that are chipping for their end users, and we will do a commercial arrangement with them, and they will have access to our forest and bring their chipper into the forest and their chip liners and deliver straight from the forest to the end user, or to the energy centre in Timaru, or to Christchurch. It's, you know, once that arrangement's been made, and then it's theirs to come and chip.
Yeah. Sure. So Andrew, okay, I understand the concept. It's fantastic for the forestry industry to deal with its debris in the situation of Tolaga Bay. But like, say for instance, we've got these chips here. Mm-hmm. When you burn this, it's effectively releasing carbon. So how's it be? I mean, obviously it's replacing coal, but how does the cycle work effectively so that the wood fibre is part of a better solution for everyone? Yeah, well, obviously it's a renewable resource. Coal takes 300 million years to be produced, and then it's burnt, it's gone. So with a wood residue, or with a tree, yes, it's burnt in this final form, but this is only a very small percentage of the products that come from a wood. So you've got saw logs that produce lumber, plywood that is still storing carbon. So from a percentage perspective, in a tree, not a lot is burnt. But it is one of the end usages. But we will plant the trees again back on our cutover, and that tree is growing again in 30 years' time and restoring carbon. So as opposed to 300 million years. Yes, for coal.
which is pretty much, even though it originally was a, is of a carbon, but it takes 300 million years to produce.
I cannot underestimate how big of an opportunity this is for New Zealand to turn off or down our reliance on imported fossil fuels, but at what cost? Currently, the forest estate in New Zealand is 1.73 million hectares, but to grow a future biofuel sector, as the New Zealand Bioenergy strategy outlines, which is developed jointly by the New Zealand Forestry and Bioenergy sectors, envisaging New Zealand could sustainably supply all of our transport fuel demands by 2030 from this type of wood residue biofuel. But that would be from an extra forest of 2.7 million hectares on the lower productive land, as they describe. Could trees be the new oil? Well, I wanted to know about how they get the slash off the hill. This is alongside, of course, those valuable harvest logs. So Glenn shows me how they use a grapple system to mechanise getting the logs safely off the hill.
So what's happening here is there's a camera attached to the front of the carriage, which relays to a TV screen in the cab. So what he's done now is he's found his log, he'll lower the skyline, drop it down, put the grapple over the log, flick the switch in the cab, close the grapple, and then pull it back up to the landing.
The camera's going all the way down, and then from up in the cab he can sort of literally use his fingers to pick it up. But what would have traditionally been the case in this scenario of felling on such a steep land?
So after the boys have manually felled it themselves, we would set the hauler up just as we have, but we would have butt rigging on it.
So that's someone down on the
so
ground
that's just
loading it?
a couple of chains tied to the skyline and the mane and the tail, and then we'd have two guys down the hill and just a series of toots. We use a tooter system, and we have two guys down the hill, and then they would hook the logs up, walk in, hook the logs up, walk out a designated distance to what we deem as safe, and then Mike would then pull it back up the hill.
So you can definitely see how there could be massive health and safety with
breaking out, and tree falling is a high risk part of the industry. But fortunately, with people going mechanised and having grapple carriages, that has taken men off the hill, which has reduced a lot of the risks.
There's a lot of capital and time in setting up the harvesting sites, so I wanted to ask Phil how they harvest sustainably.
So what we're trying to achieve through our business here in New Zealand is what we call a sustainable yield harvest. So we aim to be able to harvest a set volume every year into perpetuity. So what we do is we build what we call our forest structure around that. So we have many stands, as I mentioned, 500 stands, and those 500 stands are of all different ages. So they range from age 0, or they've just been planted, right the way through to age 30, where they're ready to harvest. And so what we do over time is we build our forest structure so that we can harvest a regular volume every year into perpetuity.
Well, that makes sense from a business perspective.
Yes.
But also, does it make sense from an environmental perspective that you're not going to have a huge, vast area of bare land once every 30 years?
Correct, it does. And certainly, I mean, we do have some reasonably large cutover, what we call cutover or clear fell sites. They can be as large as 50 hectares in some instances, so they're not insignificant in size. But we're certainly not clear felling full catchment areas. We take a number of factors into account when we're looking at harvesting a particular stand. As I say, the prime one is the age of the crop and our constraints around producing a sustainable wood flow. So we can't cut all the stands in one particular area in 1 year. So first of all, the main thing that drives us is a sustainable harvest. Then the next thing is the terrain that the crop is planted on. And so what harvesting system we use also dictates when we harvest, because our harvesting crews have got to be set up with different equipment for each of those type of operations. So other things we take into account is the market, clearly. So our sustainable harvest will vary plus or minus 10% every year, depending on what the market conditions are like. When market conditions are really good, we might harvest 10% more than our sustainable cut. When they're poor, we'll reduce by 10%. But one thing we do is we always maintain a level of production that allows us to support our contractors, because they're investing a lot of money in this kit. It's important that we keep them going.
Well, the Opinion Maker Show is proudly brought to you by our friends at Farmlands. As I said, give us your opinion. I really, really genuinely want to hear if what you're hearing within this program is true or examples where it's not. If you're watching along on Facebook or YouTube, you can have a yarn with whoever is also watching along live and email us sarah@sarahscountry.com.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
Australia and New Zealand are home to some of the world's most innovative farming pioneers. Zematic is proud to partner with farmers who are committed to leading the way in sustainable water management. The Trailblazer Sustainable Irrigation Awards celebrate sustainable irrigation management, irrigation-driven improvements, waterway protection and environmental stewardship. See how our Trailblazers are leading the way at irrigationtrailblazer.com/winners.
Now, sustainable is a word used a lot in relation to a sustainable business model. Well, that's what I was hearing. But I really wanted to understand is the sustainability on the environment. Well, Port Blakely's Environment Manager, Zach Robinson, takes a question that I put to him from our audience. Are pine plantations biological deserts?
What I really wanted to talk to you about, Zach, was, there's this term that forests are biological deserts, and we are currently in the Raincliffe forest, and you see all the organic matter dropping on the ground, and with native trees or indigenous forests. But then when you've got straight pine plantations, they seem very sort of eerie and different.
Yeah.
How much truth is in that whole biological desert and the soil quality within different types of forests?
Okay, well, so there's sort of two questions there. The biological desert one I struggle with. I fully appreciate the view though, the comments. You're right, when there's a young plantation and it's thickened before it's been tended to, it's not around the trees or the soil type, it's just a lack of light, just like anything. So to be able to do all the environmental work that we do, and our native, we just had a look at about 500 odd hectares of significant natural areas. That's what we focus on, because the trees are what pay for that work. It's very much like a farm, I view. The paddocks are there for grazing and being developed, yet the waterways that are fenced off, and that's where the biodiversity value is. In saying that, I don't believe plantation forestry in itself is a biodiversity desert. Animals will still use that for shelter, species will use that for travelling through. It's all around connectivity. At the end of the day, falcons in particular, they thrive in plantation forestry. So I do struggle with that one, but I do appreciate where those comments come from as well, and all those views really.
Yeah, because the forestry that we get to experience as the public is very much like we're standing in here in Raincliffe, or native bush, which is a lot more moist, and it's got much louder bird song and things like that as well. So I just want to balance that. Yeah,
it's again, if I put it, it's a land use. It's got to be productive. It's not a scenic reserve, plantation forestry. There's no doubt about that. But as you're seeing earlier, there's significant native indigenous forest protected in amongst all that, creating a network of corridors for wildlife and ecosystems to spread. There's no doubt once the trees get older, they get tended and the light come in. There's really, really good indigenous understory developing if there's a good seed source. So that's why having those remnant indigenous areas within the plantation really help.
Another audience's question that came in prior to our trip to put to them is, what about the risks to monocultured Pinus radiata being predominantly planted here in New Zealand? I jumped in the car with Andrew Cocking again to find out more around this potential biosecurity risk.
Do worry about the, as they say, monoculture, the large parcels of land that is just in one particular species. We see the likes of what can happen with PSA and kiwi fruit and things when they're so reliant on a monospecies.
Well, I think it's any commodity or crop in New Zealand has got a biosecurity risk, and as an industry we've got to be managing it well. and for any incursions. It's caused issues in Canada, it's caused issues in Europe. So, yep, just like bees, microbovis, the forest industry has to be aware of the risks. But predominantly, we're a US-owned family company, and Douglas fir is who they are as well in the US. So, and then they want to have some of that for diversity. But radiata is still our, it's something special to New Zealand. We've adapted it to our conditions. We've genetically, all grown and stronger, stiffer species compared to its original Monterey pine in California. So it has its place, and it always has its place, because before that we were logging our native, and New Zealand needed a replacement species. Otherwise we were going to probably be an importer of timber. So radiata was found for that purpose. Yeah. Right. So I always say it protects our native. If we didn't have an exotic species to manage in New Zealand, where would New Zealand be getting its timber from?
Well, that's a valid point, but the supply of wood to meet New Zealand's domestic demand is under immense pressure since early 2019, based on the rising demand for our housing construction boom and international log prices. Will we have to wait on more forests to be planted? Do we have 30 years? Are we going to have to import more logs? Well, Andrew continues to give me a look at their silviculture operation, how they thin and plant those trees as the job that keeps their planting crews in work outside of planting time.
This is a Douglas fir stand. It's 17 years of age. We would have planted it at 1,600 stems per hectare, and that's a full stocking level. At age 17, we've come through with a thinning crew, thin to waste crew, men on chainsaws, and their prescription is to bring the stocking down to around 700 stems per hectare. And at the same time, it's doing selection and spacing and looking for form. So obviously this tree is a really good example of a tree that we've thinned out, because we don't want that tree to grow on to anymore. And the tree beside it is of a better form. And we'll put probably another 30 years on these final crop now. So these are our winners. Those are our losers, these are our winners. And these are what will be our future material for domestic mills. And what you see now is how the stand will be now left and left for another 30 years to grow on. So these will decompose.
Well, to finish off with the TB outbreak in Hawke's Bay and the transfer of disease throughout these forests, I wanted to know about forest owners' responsibility for pest management, as well as their thoughts on wilding pine taking over our high country. Zach Robinson answers my question, as well as we hear about the work they're doing to protect the endangered bat. Yes, that's right, the South Island endangered bat that Port Blakely is working with regional councils to ensure its longevity.
So, I mean, obviously we talked about wilding pines, but there's the pests, there's the possums, there's the stoats and pigs. And I mean, I know a lot of concern in pastoral farming is around TB and what comes out forest owners' responsibility for pest management. Mm-hmm. How do you see it and your role and responsibility in that?
Oh, we do a huge amount of pest control and pest management. We have pest management plans for all our pest species. It's an interesting one. The whole, pests don't really adhere to property boundaries. So whether they're coming from forestry to farms or farms to forestry, it doesn't really matter. Just the control needs to be pragmatic, and my view is that for significant control to be successful, it's got to be on scale. We do a whole range of, so when we talk about pest control, so we have it for our forestry and production purposes. We also do quite a lot for biodiversity purposes. So the forest we're standing in here today has a network of good-natured traps through the whole forest on a 100 by 100 grid.
Yeah, they're good traps, those.
Yeah, they're here. They've been here for 4 years. Every year prior to the bat breeding season, we do a pest monitoring program using wax tags and ink tunnels, and then we usually do a leg hold trapping to knock the possum numbers down as well.
So, is that just because you're trying to protect the bats though?
Yep, just for bats. So that's just for biodiversity. Yep. We also have another one for our jewelled gecko, kokako, and another bat colony over in Māori Gully as well. So that's the pest control we do purely for biodiversity value. Then we have a whole range of pest control we do for production purposes, any issues with neighbours, those sorts of things. So wallabies is a big one here in South Canterbury. We do a huge amount of work with wallabies and working in with the regulators as well.
What about working in with community and that whole idea of a catchment coming together, all stakeholders around an area that all genuinely care about the ecology of that area? I know that you've been involved in a lot of discussion groups and action groups and things like that. What have you seen sort of maturity and shift in conversation, particularly in South Canterbury?
Oh, absolutely. I think the community here, it's such a fragmented landscape. There's a lot of different land uses that neighbour each other, and my personal experience is that we're all at the table for the same reasons. We have a really good dialogue and discussions that go forward from that. We do participate, and we are on a lot of catchment groups that we're in, and try and work together with all our neighbours and land users to get outcomes basically that meet everyone's needs.
Well, emotions have been highly charged is one way of putting it around forestry and sheep and beef farmers cohabiting in the same communities, as well as regional council and communities' approach to forestry as a land use. So what does the future look like for a more harmonious, would you say, relationship between these competing land uses? I certainly enjoyed my time at Port Blakely and certainly enjoyed the opportunity to ask those questions that I genuinely wanted to understand on behalf of you, the audience. And I'm sure there is so many more questions that I could have asked. I certainly don't have the answer into what this harmonious relationship could potentially look like, but I definitely commend the likes of Phil Taylor, who is throwing the door open, warts and all, to rebuild the social license within the rural community that forestry wants to coexist alongside pastoral farming. I hope that I have provided you with a bit more of an interesting insight into a working forestry operation, something that you may have been in the same boat as me and not knowing a lot about, to hear firsthand of what is going on at Port Blakely, and we really hope is going on in our pine plantation forests that are owned by overseas owners, and we genuinely hope they too can care about the environment and the community as much as the team at Port Blakely. I just want to lastly thank Phil, Andrew and Zach for their time and taking myself and Joel on an interesting field trip. And let's hope that in the future we can do another one of these on Sarah's Country. If you've got a suggestion on what you'd like to see behind the scenes on, please flick me an email, sarah@sarahscountry.com. Now we'll be back next week with our opinion maker from backstage at E Tipu Boma Grow Summit here in Christchurch, where we talk to the likes of Sir Ian Taylor, Wim de Koning from Lincoln University, John Arrell from Farmlands, and the inspiring Melissa Clark-Reynolds on how the sector can deal with not just change, but exponential change. All that next Tuesday here on Sarah's Country.